This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The medieval period spans from around 500 to 1500 CE. The term medieval comes from the Latin for Middle Ages. During the Renaissance, historians called the time between the fall of the Roman Empire and their epoch the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages. Let's take a look at what life was like during these 1,000 years. Generalizing life during the Middle Ages is difficult, as the medieval period lasted twice as long as the time between the end of the medieval era and today. In 410 CE, Romans had ruled Britain for over 300 years. Once the Roman Empire fell, Roman Britain was left to fend for itself. Almost immediately, invaders started raiding towns and villages across the country. Irish invaded from the west, Picts from the north, and later the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes from Europe. By 500 CE, Germanic-speaking people had settled deep inland. The Anglo-Saxons, considered to be the original English, controlled most of the lowlands of Britain by the 650s, and the land they occupied was known as Angleland. During this time, the Anglo-Saxon word for a slave was interchangeable with the word Briton. Little is known about daily life during the early medieval period, but life for many people may have improved after the fall of Rome. Most of the everyday people were farmers. Without the Roman taxes and the wealthy aristocrats that used slaves to work their land, farming communities could better support themselves and their families. Of course, this life probably didn't last for long, as separate groups merged to form kingdoms, and rulers would inevitably start demanding loyalty and tributes. The Anglo-Saxons lived in wood huts with pitched roofs thatched with straw. The houses were dug into the earth, and the roofs extended to the ground. The dwellings consisted of one room with a fireplace in the middle, with a hole in the ceiling to allow the smoke to escape. The floors were wooden and strewn with rushes, and furniture would have included a table, folding iron chairs, a bed, and chests to keep belongings. Tapestries were hung from the walls, for warmth more than decoration. The Roman villas and towns, with their baths and stone streets, fell into disrepair as the Anglo-Saxons rejected the Roman way of life. The Anglo-Saxons had a seemingly more primitive existence than the Romans, who had enjoyed underfloor heating, stone houses with tiled roofs, and glazed windows. This is one of the reasons the medieval period is sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. Anglo-Saxon villages were tiny, usually consisting of less than 100 people. The biggest house belonged to the chief, and other huts were used for making pottery or weaving. The Anglo-Saxons were skilled craftspeople, making iron tools and jewelry from glass, gemstones, and gold. These villages were self-sufficient, keeping pigs and grazing cattle as well as hunting and fishing. Despite this, they had very little meat, but a lot of seasonal fruit and vegetables. Their main staple was the bread they made from the wheat they farmed. They also grew barley to make beer and oats to make porridge and to feed their animals. Beer was more sanitary than plain water, but at that time, people didn't realize this was due to boiling the water rather than any other part of the process. At the age of 10, an Anglo-Saxon child would be viewed and treated as an adult. Only children of wealthy families were taught to read and write, and Christian churches ran the schools. Children from poorer families had access to education only by leaving their homes and training to be monks or nuns. Anglo-Saxon villages were often built near a river and within the existing walls of fortified Roman towns. The English language is a testament to the constant influx of different cultures, and we can see this in many ways, one being the days of the week. Saturn Day, Sunday, and Moon Day are the Roman planetary gods, but Tuesday, Woden's or Odin's Day, Thor's Day, and Freya's Day all came from the Germanic and Scandinavian cultures. Britain was split up between various Anglo-Saxon and Celtic groups, and power fluctuated between these groups, which continued until the arrival of the Vikings in the 790s. The Vikings plundered the kingdoms of Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, and East Anglia to the east, which only left Wessex in the south. In 878, King Alfred of Wessex defeated the Viking army, but a treaty was signed, leaving the Vikings control of most of northern and eastern England. These lands were then known as the Danelaw. Subsequent years saw various battles and power transfers between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons until the Norman invasion of 1066. Edward the Confessor had restored the House of Wessex to its former glory, having subdued the Danes. Upon his death in 1066, Edward left no heir, and his successor was highly contested. Harold Godwinson seized the throne, only to be defeated months later by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. This effectively ended the Anglo-Saxon period, and Britain was now under Norman control. It is interesting to note that the Normans were descendants of the Northmen, otherwise known as Vikings, that were allowed to settle in northern France. Much of this power struggle did not affect the ordinary people unless they were unlucky enough to live where two armies clashed in battle. Most Saxon farmers were more concerned about crop failure than who was in charge of the country. Life in Norman Britain depended heavily on social class. There were two main classes: the ruling class, the lords, and the villeins, feudal tenants, who tended the land. The villeins were allowed their land to grow crops and to tend to animals. They also had to work their lords' lands. Both men and women worked in the fields, with the women being responsible for preparing and preserving food and looking after the animals. Bread and ale were still dietary staples for most people. The lords spent time on education, reading Latin manuscripts, and learning to fight. Archery and hunting were popular pastimes, and many lords forbade commoners from hunting in their private forests. The different lives of these two distinct classes can still be seen in how we call some cooked meats by a different animal name. The lords during the Norman era were largely French, and the villagers were descendants of Anglo-Saxons, which left a lasting mark on the English language. The French nobles ate cooked pork, beef, veal, and mouton, while the Anglo-Saxon farmers looked after the pigs, cows, calves, and sheep. A valuable source of information about life in Norman Britain is the Doomsday Book. Despite its auspicious name, the book listed the people's holdings under Norman rule during the time of William the Conqueror and was probably used for tax purposes. From this book, we know that most people in England and some parts of Wales were either A. villeins, who owned land in exchange for labor, B. bordars, who were like villeins but only owned enough land to feed a small family, or C. slaves. People at the time were not allowed to relocate without the express permission of their lord. Some commoners lived in small towns, but cities such as London and Winchester were exempt from paying tax and therefore not included in the book. Day-to-day village life for the Normans was very similar to that of the Anglo-Saxons before them. One notable difference was the houses. Norman village houses were made using a wooden frame covered in wattle and daub, which is straw mixed with mud and dung to make a rudimentary cement. The Normans also built some of the first stone castles in England, several of which are still standing today. Contrary to the view that food in the medieval period was bland, many spices were used in cooking, including nutmeg, caraway, ginger, cardamom, and pepper. The Norman period came to an end in 1154 when the House of Plantagenet came to power. Otherwise known as the House of Anjou, the line descended from the union of Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou, a province in the southeast of France, and Empress Matilda, who was the granddaughter of William the Conqueror. The Plantagenets ruled for the remainder of the medieval period, when the Wars of the Roses ushered in the Tudor Age. It was a time of great disruption due to rebellions, social change, and the Black Plague that swept through Europe from 1346 to 1352. Images of knights, banquets, and majestic castles probably come to mind when people think of the medieval period, all of which come from the late Middle Ages. For common people, life was getting more complicated. While many men were classed as serfs, tied to the land and the ruling lord, some were freemen who paid rent for the land. They could also be half-free, paying some rent and some servitude. However, if a freeman couldn't pay his taxes, his status could change to that of a serf, and likewise, serfs could become free men. To become free, you needed to have it granted to you by the lord, or you could try and take it for yourself by escaping. If you could live in a burrow for a year and a day without being caught, you became free, as long as you remembered to pay your taxes. As a woman, your freedom would be tied to that of your husband. Children of freemen were also deemed free, and serfdom awaited for the children of serfs. The population grew at the start of this period, likely due to a milder climate and improved agricultural techniques. Houses also got bigger. The chimney was invented, and many houses now were over one story. These houses were usually for wealthier nobles and merchants, while poorer peasants lived in one-room huts made of wood, straw, and mud. Many market towns from this period still exist, and you can see many examples of architecture from this period. In 1215, the first Parliament of England was formed, taking absolute power away from the monarchy. This had little to do with the common people and more about the nobility, as Parliament consisted of nobles and bishops who represented each county and town. When the Black Death hit the south of England in 1348, the people of England had been weakened by war and crop failures. By 1350, the plague had reached Scotland, and it is estimated that around half of the population died. Before the plague, people believed God decided who lived in a noble's life and who was destined to be a serf. After the plague spread through rich and poor alike, it became apparent that God had not spared his favored lords. There was also an excess of labor, which meant that people were more content with their lot and felt that they had no choice but to work for their lord to keep their families fed. There was also more available land, which meant that commoners could move around more easily and that their labor was now a valuable commodity. In an attempt to regain control over their subordinates, authorities put law in place that meant it was a crime to refuse work or break an existing contract. These laws were applied more to the laborers than the employers. In 1361, the punishment for refusing work included branding and imprisonment. It was clear that the government was on the landowner's side, which led to the Peasants Revolt in 1381. The peasants demanded the end of serfdom, that the church's wealth should be given to the poor, and that all men should be free and equal. They attacked many leading officials and even decapitated the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury. The revolt ended when the 14-year-old King Richard II met the rebels and promised to end serfdom for good. He did not keep his promise, and the rebels were hunted down and hanged. However, things did improve for the poor as the rebellion had frightened the rich, and they realized they could not push commoners too far. No government collected a poll tax until 1990. Peasants could work for more money, marry who they wished, and move where they pleased. The medieval period came to an end when Henry Tudor took the throne. 7 years later, Christopher Columbus sailed to America. The medieval era helped shape our modern era in many ways. It was a hard existence with a high rate of infant mortality and a life of servitude for most of the population. The constant influx of cultures and transfer of power contributed to the diversity of the English language. These near-constant invasions probably influenced how Britain colonized so many other countries during the Age of Discovery. To learn more about medieval England, check out our book, Medieval England, a captivating guide to English history in the Middle Ages, including events such as the Norman Conquest, Black Death, and 100 Years' War. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.